So, welcome everyone for the 100th time. Welcome everyone this very time to this webinar, Russian Disinformation during Coronacrisis and Beyond, Strategy, Channels, Topics, and Target Audience. Without introductions of the topic, Nina Jankowicz is with us, Disinformation Fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center, zooming in from Washington. Maciej Kawecki, Dean at the Business University in Warsaw. Nad'a Kovalčíková, Program Manager and Fellow at Alliance for Securing Democracy in the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Patryk Pawlak, Executive Officer at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Cybulska, Deputy Director of the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Jurgis Wilczynskas, Deputy Head of Strategic Communications and Information Analysis Division at the European External Action Service. So, let's get down to our questions, to our topics. My first question goes to Nad'a Kovalčíková. What are the main manipulative narratives by Russia, by China, by other powers that you are dealing with? What are the major manipulative disinformation narratives? What do they have in common and why they are spread?
So the main narratives we have observed during the first at least 6 months of the pandemic, since the lockdown started in Europe and in other Western countries. One of them was focusing of China on rehabilitation of its own image, because the virus originated in China and there was a delayed response of China. There was a lot of blame. And so China was trying to rehabilitate this image through some narratives and actions of delivering aid, but also selling the protective equipment, selling the masks or some medical tools, while at the same time also manipulating the narrative of promoting themselves rather as benefactors, even though much of this effort was actually pure trade. Quite a prominent narrative in the very first phases, which continued later on. Second, shifting the blame, the manipulated narrative which tried to actually put the blame on the United States and Italy or Europe more widely about the spread of the virus or even the origin of virus. Also blaming NATO that it kind of brought the virus or created it in the labs. And this was also something that was not only created by the Chinese official accounts, but then also promoted further by the Russian accounts or Iranian state media accounts. So something that had kind of a circular amplification in the information space. But at the same time, they were blaming the sanctions from the US for the kind of delayed or insufficient response, especially China and Iran. We push for this message from their own accounts. They did amplify the Chinese and Iranian messages about sanctions being one of the causes of the delayed or insufficient, inadequate responses of China and Iran to the pandemic. Another quite a prominent manipulated narrative we have observed was promotion of authoritarianism over democracy. The way they did it was they were trying to show the cleavages or even kind of widen the gaps, the coordination, criticism of the EU member states, or even the lack of cooperation between the US and Europe as democratic actors to counter the pandemic. For example, some Russian state was promoting a narrative that the refugees from the Greek refugees were coming to Europe with the virus because they wanted to infect the Germans and others that were exposed to their presence, or they were arguing some narratives that they were that the countries were just not really able and really helping other countries. So while some of them, the narratives can reflect the fact that yes, the coordination took some time and could have been faster and better and more effective, these narratives continued even when the measures have been already put in place to kind of fuel these tensions and the impression sometimes just of the fact how uncoordinated or inefficient the democracies are in comparison to the authoritarian regimes. This was done both for the international audiences and spread on the social media networks such as Twitter or Facebook, which are not usually, or some of them, accessible in Iran or China. They did audiences to keep control and to keep showing their audiences that they are capable of addressing the crisis effectively. I could continue, but I know there will be.
I have just one follow-up question. How were these narratives effective? Did have many people nationally and internationally been persuaded that, for example, authoritarian systems are better than democratic ones?
Well, you could see some polls about the trust in the governments. It's hard to, of course, say that the concrete impact of these narratives really led directly to the decrease of the trust in institutions or governmental authorities in democracies. But you could see in the most recent polls that the trust in governments during the crisis, especially in the first phase, was really decreasing. At the same time, the most recent Pew Research survey is still much higher than in authoritarian regimes government. So this impact, first of all, we have to divide what is maybe temporary impact, what is impression, and what is more longer term impact. What is problematic about the manipulated narratives during pandemic literally have their serious health consequences when people, for example, do not their leaders leading from the front wearing the mask, and they may refuse themselves to wear a mask or keep social distance. And we saw that the people basically repeated some narratives from the messaging they have been seen circulating, the chaotic messaging, the kind of controversial messaging where one thing to wear a mask for, and then you would see these more closed groups conversations, so more covered conversations, which would about the effectiveness of certain measures. And this has been amplified because there has been an intention to.
Thank you very much, Nad'a. Now, just before asking Lyubov to give us a perspective on Ukraine and maybe comparing some narratives in Ukraine with European Union's ones, I wanted to just inform our panelists and also people that are with us here that in order for everyone to be able to know what our speakers have to say, we are writing an article, and we will also inform you what are the most important takes provided by each of our panelists. So we'll continue now, but we'll do this article so that everyone can know what we had to say here today. So Lyubov, as I mentioned, what are the major narratives, manipulative narratives used in Ukraine, and how could you compare them with narratives used in EU countries?
Yes, thank you for having me, and it's my pleasure to be in one company with such knowledgeable and experienced experts. With regard to the narratives of Russian propaganda and Chinese propaganda, in our case, it's mostly Russian propaganda. We don't have powerful Chinese actors. But I must say that Russian propaganda machine does a great job for both of them, because mostly China is in favor of Russian propaganda, and they both blame EU and United States in everything what is happening around the. So these narratives for Ukraine and the EU, they mostly coincide, and the majority of this narrative coincide. We have also seen a number of conspiracy theories and some attempts in the States and in the medical system in particular. The principle is always the same, polarization, but in the EU, the Kremlin on different vulnerabilities to achieve the best effect. And of course, they have to adapt these narratives. For instance, narrative of about the artificial origin of the virus was presented in Ukraine as the United States created the virus in its secret labs in Ukraine. So they make it very relevant to the population, very emotional and very topical to what's going on in the country. And we also see that these narratives are very much interconnected, because like the narrative I just said about American labs in Ukraine, it contributes to the grand narrative Russia has on Ukraine about external governance. They say that Ukraine is ruled by the EU and mostly by the United States, of course, and it also is kind of continuation of another narrative about failed state, that Ukraine is not able to govern itself. So basically the set of these narratives are cool, but they just adapt them to new challenges, new events. And the goal behind it, of course, to undermine public trust into institutions and spread chaos, is the same that Moscow has been pursuing for a long time, ultimately aimed at weakening the Western states, Western societies. And in order to reach this, they constitute this deadly mix of conspiracy theories, manipulative messages, and on traditional media, spreading disinformation online, and good old measures straight from the KGB playbook. But of course, success of the disinformation campaigns or an operation of influence, which involves several tools, and this can be the media, political parties, key to have the bunch of these allies, and all above mentioned components, basically. But most important among them, I think, is media. And there are several pro-Russian media in Ukraine, and they have Ukrainian ownership documents. Ukrainian citizens work for them, but they broadcast Russian messages. And each of these channels has its own Russian curator. Usually this is a person who has worked in Russia for one of the state TV channels, and who perfectly knows how the machine should operate. And all political content is controlled by these Moscow curators. And in 2006, Russian TV channels, and Kremlin unfortunately didn't stop there and launched an even more effective mechanism, Ukrainian pro-Russian TV channels, which is very difficult to regulate or to close, as we did with Russian TV channels, because otherwise our government will be accused in censorship or political persecution. So I think that without local allies, Russian propaganda wouldn't be so successful. And these narratives they spread, which my colleague just described, again, it's like the whole bunch of narratives crossing the Europe is here as well. But what makes them especially workable and effective is local allies. Yeah, thank you. I hope you got something from my speech.
Thank you, Lyubov. Dr. Maciej Kawecki, could you tell us what is the disinformation situation in Poland?
Hello, everyone. I understand firstly, I will do what is my best to be as short as it's possible because our delay. As I understand your questions, like a question about the scale of disinformation in Poland. I would like to show you the results of report published by the Polish organizations, which undoubtedly proves that the scale of disinformation internet users admit that they have been manipulated or disinformed in recent months. 35% of them, yes, 35% of them are disinformed once a week or more often. And such data results from a new report published by the Polish Social Research Laboratory of NASK. And researchers asked people from Poland about their opinions and observations regarding disinformation activities on the internet, and the results show that the false or manipulated information is absolutely common. 8.3% of us recognize news every day, 50% several times a week, and 11% once a week. And only 2% of respondents. The most common type of disinformation for Polish people is the fake news. The respondents also mention trolling, action troll, fake accounts on social networks, manipulated photos, and among the places where manipulation and disinformation occur, the most frequently mentioned are information portal informations, political pages on Facebook, and discussion forums. And from my point of view, the most important is the answer for the question, who is responsible for creating such information in the opinion of our citizens. Most of us indicate the Polish government, 5% of the Polish people. Next, the respondent mentioned the opinions of political opposition parties, the education system, and teachers. Today in Poland, we have a National Day of Education, so it's very important, I think. And finally, 20% of us indicate the parties of the government coalition. And to summarize, I think my answer for your question. It seems to me that it's very sad that the government, authorities, administration, and therefore the bodies formally responsible for fighting with disinformation are considered, in the opinions of the public, to be spreading disinformation. That's my answer.
Yes, indeed, as you're saying, it's really sad that disinformation is first so ubiquitous. Second, people are really aware of its existence. Plus, they don't trust so much the formal institutions of democracy. It's really sad and scary.
Absolutely true.
Nina Jankowicz, your book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict has just been published. You look there into Poland, Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, and Georgia. What are the main enemies in winning the information war, and what do these countries have in common?
What Maciej was just saying about the information environment in Poland, I think the main theme between these 5 countries is that you cannot fight disinformation when you are yourself practicing disinformation. And if you look at, the Polish national security doctrine or the Georgian national security doctrine, even to some extent this applies to Ukraine, it could apply to Czechia as well. These countries which have no, rose-colored glasses, they understand what threat Russia poses, and that's all spelled out very cleanly in their, national security documents. But in terms of domestic disinformation, they're turning a blind eye to that. And I think we're in a very similar position here in the United States today. We have our own government and our own officials who are spreading disinformation. And just this morning, as we're sitting here, there's another round of disinformation about Joe Biden and Ukraine being spread. And this is a huge problem. And I think that's the same in Poland. It's the same in Georgia. When government is using, which are very similar, in fact, in some cases identical to the tactics that Russia or other adversaries are using, it creates an incongruence in your policy. And it means that you're able to play whack-a-troll, to take down accounts on social media that are offensive coming from outside of your borders, but it also leaves open a big ability for adversaries like Russia to launder their narratives into the public sphere through domestic actors. And we've seen that in Poland a lot. So, I thought I was going to be writing this book in Russian disinformation, but the big nugget is actually that we need to recognize the threat of domestic disinformation. Politicization of disinformation is the biggest threat to our winning the information war.
Thank you, Nina. So this looks like we have to have two totally different sources of combating disinformation. Ones that Nad'a and you both were talking about, created by Russia and other big powers, and the second ones domestically created by domestic actors.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think around 4 years ago, or maybe a little bit before that, we wouldn't have perhaps thought that we'd be in this situation. But here we are today, where we've let the domestic disinformation environment get out of control. We thought of this as just a foreign problem, but really it's two sides to the same coin. And in fact, what we're seeing ahead of the US election, I know we plan to talk about that, but since we are cut short on time, I figure I'll squish all my answers together. That there's more information laundering happening than the traditional kind of inauthentic amplification through bots and trolls and things like that. And that's domestically is also really important.
Thank you, Nina. Jurgis, so what is the European Union doing about the disinformation wave, and how is EU versus disinfo making a difference in this fight?
Thank you, Carolina, for question. One thing we should sort of take into account when we speak about the EU's response to disinformation is the fact that, the threat will stay there, so we know that, we've seen already for 5-6 years different pro-Kremlin disinformation attacks on European Union member states, on our open societies. And we've seen very much, that this is viewed by our adversary to some degree as a zero-sum game. So we should be ready, for response which requires really sort of a marathon preparation, right? It's not a sprint, it's not that we have now in our hands a silver bullet, essentially the disinformation campaigns. So, today, as it sort of provides this decoy, a health emergency as a decoy to attack, undermine the trust in governments. Tomorrow it could be something else, maybe something with anti-vax, vaccination campaign could serve as a kind of decoy as well. Good. What we can do? What we are doing also at European level. We're doing several things. First, we try to get better at detecting and exposing these disinformation campaigns. So, for example, in European External Action Service, we monitor, the whole, let's say, ecosystem of pro-Kremlin sources. Maybe not all of it, but significant part of it in nearly 20 languages. So this enables us a little bit to collect what are disinformation narratives that are spread there, some of these narratives or conspiracy theories. The second thing that we can do better is, of course, to connect those like-minded countries, like-minded fact-checkers, think tanks, NGOs, who basically do the same job, similar job, and who actually could enable a better collective response to the issue. And here, I mean, some speakers already mentioned the online platforms play a really important part, because they are basically at the same time the vehicles for which the disinformation spread, and on the other hand, I mean, they also have means and capability to stop this. And we have seen that in COVID crisis, some of the actions that platforms took, like Google, like Facebook, like Twitter, really helped to cut a bit on the level of disinformation. Now, the other important venue in terms of response is, of course, the work with the media and support to the independent media that we should really deliver. I mean, unfortunately, in COVID times, media is very much a victim because of the dropping advertising revenues. And I think here in Brussels, EU institutions, member states now have a very serious also dialogue how to help support these independent voices, that they don't essentially die because of, financial issues, that they don't, that they're not hijacked, by financial groups. So this is another sort of very important venue. And the last thing that I would flag is raising about the issue, because still of the threat that is, stands in front of us. For example, in terms of awareness raising, we have EU versus Disinfo, a website and also social media accounts, which are subscribed now more by 100,000, people, experts, journalists, citizens. But still, it's not enough. We have to do more on awareness raising, and this event is also one of the venues that we can do it. So that's a little bit in short, just to get the taste what EU is doing now, and we will definitely do much more by the end of the year. We will also have a European Democracy Action Plan coming up. So very important policy document, which will also set, how we can better deal with the, elections interference, how we better deal with media support, how we better tackle disinformation. So that's in short. Over to you, Carolina.
Thank you very much. And this 100,000 sounds good, but on the other hand, of course, I have in mind that European Union has around 450 million citizens, and much more of them out of us should be aware. But as Maciej Kawecki mentioned, there is a lot of awareness, but that doesn't suffice. Patryk, Pawlak. I would like to ask you about the broader approach in terms of policy responses as regards the challenge of disinformation. So what are the policy responses, and why it is so difficult to make them really working?
Thank you, Carolina, and hopefully those who stayed with us on the line will manage to hear me correctly. I think I will start with a very general observation when it comes to why is it so difficult to design effective policy responses, even though these policy responses are multiplying, as we have just heard. I think one most important factor is really the problem of the definition of the problem itself. What is disinformation, or when certain activities become disinformation? Where is the threshold over which we actually decide to act as the policymaker? Very simple examples, where certain disinformation or campaigns organized through social media become a political and security problem that think they should be concerned about and get involved. So one of the examples over the past month, for instance, which gives this political flavor to the disinformation rather than disinformation as such. And And I think there is a big difficulty in defining what this threshold for the action is. We've heard that there are certain initiatives that are targeting, for instance, social media platforms and require action on their side. But when do we move a step higher? When do we actually enter with more political responses and the stronger policy tools rather than just, let's say, code of conduct for social media platforms or tech companies, right? I think one of the questions that we're also struggling with as a policy community is, does all information or disinformation require response? By who and at which stage, and which point of the process? We are talking here about disinformation originating from Russia and China. We not so often hear about disinformation originating from Turkey or other actors targeting the European Union, for instance, as well. So when do we actually shift this political lens and become interested in other actors in this arena? And I think Nina also put a finger on a very important part of the problem in designing the policy response, which is the fact that we talk about disinformation, but it's difficult to fight something that many of the member states and governments engage in themselves. And I think this kind of hypocrisy in response to disinformation and the fact that many actors rely on similar tools to achieve their political objective domestically is something that we really have to address. And finally, I think that when we talk about disinformation and the policy responses, we very often end up talking about similar solutions. We're basically recycling policy responses that have been already used in the past. And I think probably what we need is a bit more imagination when it comes to designing those policy responses. If you look really at the actors engaged in disinformation or interferences, we're always amazed how they come up with the new tools and techniques, which do not necessarily are super innovative, but manage to engage the audiences in a way that we would not imagine otherwise. And I think maybe similar level of imagination is really required on policy responses. Maybe sometimes we have to think about stretching some of the solutions that we already have on the table rather than think about designing new ones. So I'll stop here for the sake of time, but look forward to the discussion and next questions.
Thank you. So we just ended our first round as we got a little bit late somehow. I would like now to ask Nina 3 questions in one, because Nina has to leave us in 15 minutes. Nina, are you there? So the questions would be, how would you compare the US and Poland in the disinformation context as a first one? The second, what role does disinformation play in the US presidential run that is taking place at this very moment now? And the third, from your point of view, how to win, not to lose the information war?
Great. Thank you, Carolina. I will try to answer all 3. I'm just writing them down so I don't forget. I already touched on how similar the US and Poland are in the state of our information ecosystems. I think we both have a very difficult and the politicization of dealing with disinformation, especially in the domestic sphere. That has been a huge issue. And I think that makes it extremely difficult to make holistic policy about pushing back against disinformation. And actually, I will be testifying at the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee on Thursday, and my testimony says very much the same thing, that the biggest hurdle in fighting disinformation is our domestic disinformation. And Poland and the US, as I laid out before, both have that problem. Disinformation, unfortunately, is playing a very big role in the 2020 election. And as you mentioned, people are already voting here in the United States. We have a lot of early voting and voting by mail taking place because of the coronavirus crisis. And that creates a very different information ecosystem. Normally, we would be looking at this as a lead up to election day, but now we have election season. And so people are already casting ballots, and the ebbs and flows of information as they're happening really do have an effect on how individuals are going to be voting on a particular day if they haven't already decided. Of course, there are plenty of people who know how they're voting and won't change that. But what is also scary is that some of the disinformation, especially the domestic disinformation, deals with the very security and trust in our democratic system and our democratic processes. So for instance, we have seen a lot of disinformation about the safety of mail-in voting and mail-in balloting, voter fraud related to mail-in ballots, none of which have any basis in the truth. The amount of fraud in our elections is infinitesimal percent, but these stories are getting blown out of proportion to scare people. And so no matter what the outcome of the election is in a couple of weeks, the damage that does to it's about people's faith that their votes will be counted freely and fairly. And that's very scary. And that means that, you know, Russia and other actors don't have to do very much. Trump himself is kind of a super spreader of disinformation. And all Russia really needs to do is retweet what Trump is saying or amplify otherwise. So it's a very scary situation that we're in. And of course, all of that is hastened by the political advertising and messaging on social media platforms, which allow bad actors, be they foreign or domestic, to target their messages to exactly the right audiences that are going to find them most interesting and appealing. And that's why, to answer your third question, the most important thing that we can do, and this holds true across a lot of my research throughout Central and Eastern Europe, the countries that have begun to really make headway in winning the information war are ones that understand that ultimately this is a human problem. They invest in people. You know, Patryk was talking about raising awareness, and that's extraordinarily important. Teaching people about media and digital literacy and IT hygiene to make sure that their personal information isn't being targeted, that they're not being phished and their emails spread about the internet, particularly for government government servants. This is extremely important. And then investing in the public media space. I know in a couple of the countries that I've researched, Poland, Georgia are two of them, the takeover of public media or opposition media by the ruling party has really left a vacuum in the information ecosystem that can be filled by malign information. So to invest and protect public media so that voters always have a source of impartial information. And then the third question, I am today to go into it into detail, but we do need some social media regulation, not necessarily giving the power to the government to decide, you know, you can take down or leave up certain content, but to enforce transparency and oversight over the social media platforms. Because as it stands right now, when they take down content, we basically have to take them at their word and understand, okay, you know, that's what Facebook says happened, but we have no insight if that's what actually happened. And I think that's a real role for government in understanding and kind of looking after citizens' best interests online. That should be the role of government. We haven't quite gotten there yet in any of the regulatory frameworks that have gone forward in the United States, where we've done very little, or other places in Europe and beyond. Thanks again for having me today.
You're welcome, but may I just have a little follow-up from you? And actually, it will be a follow-up question that I would like, in a way, all of us to try to answer. Because you mentioned that in Poland and Georgia, it's the situation with takeover by the state of the public media and infusing it in with propaganda is a problem. And it's not only a problem in these two countries, it's also the same similarly in Hungary, in a way, in Belarus, in Russia, etc. So when we have this as a fundament of the disinformation fighting sphere, and on the other hand, we have governments as super spreaders, to repeat what you said about Donald Trump. What can we do on the national battlegrounds?
I think the most important thing is for voters to make clear to their elected officials that this is not this is not, you know, behavior that we're going to tolerate. And in the big conclusion to my book, which I wrote an epilogue as the impeachment investigation was happening, which seems like an eon ago. But at the very end, I said, impeachments are rare, but elections happen on a yearly basis. So making clear that there's a standard that we expect our elected officials to adhere to. That would be the first thing. And then the second thing is that it's up to each of us. The most successful disinformation is stuff that's emotional, stuff that really affects us on an individual level and holds true for our personal experience. So if you feel yourself getting emotional, don't share. Away from the computer. Practice informational distancing. And if you feel yourself after a few minutes and stepping away from your computer, stepping away from your device, feel yourself still thinking about that article, then it's time to do a little bit of research, see if other outlets are reporting this, see if the image that's attached to that article has been used elsewhere. You can teach yourself how to do a reverse image search so that you can find the earliest instance of that image or other similar images online to see if it's been altered in any way. See if you trust the reporter. Have they written other things, or is the rest of their work similarly incendiary? And so all of that is a good indicator and just slows us down so that we aren't spreading disinformation response in us. That's the most important thing. And the United States won't solve its disinformation crisis between now and November 3rd. And as I said, people are already voting. So what I'm encouraging to do is just slow down when they see things that make them angry. Just slow down and don't share.
Thank you very much, Nina, for your answers and for being here with us. Okay, so now I will be asking you double questions because it's a little bit late. So first with Nad'a Kovalčíková. So first you mentioned differing narratives created by different countries. So my question number one is, are the responses being also divergent to different narratives in the countries that you look at? So different narratives, are we having different ways of fighting them, or we just apply similar measures? And the second one is, as I asked to Nina, what are the lessons learned and what we take from these lessons as a recommendations of what to do to tackle disinformation more effectively in the nearest future?
Thanks for the question, Carolina. So I'll start with the responses to different narratives. I think the narratives, they differ and they will differ, and they always, as Nina also mentioned, exploit the emotions or the topics tailored to concrete audiences, be it a country, be it a certain political group followers, being generational differences, being different types of groups that care about concrete issues or the countries that have concrete sensitivities. So then the responses could be yes, but that is not considered very effective, because that is always responding potentially the disinformation or even being more effectively overcoming it. So, for example, what you could see, I gave example from Lithuania because they just had elections, and there was some analysis already how effectively they were able to counter or prevent disinformation. Is basically resilience building that takes time and is something that you need to do much before elections. Elections, as Nina said, they take place regularly. There are different levels, but also there's a peak of attention maybe a few days before the elections. But the shaping of the minds and of people's understanding or persuading them about something, that takes much longer time and happens much earlier than the elections themselves. So in Lithuania, for example, or in Finland, from my experience, there is more historical experience with Russian money and the awareness about the narratives that are being spread or have been spread already for years, if not longer, about EU or NATO trying to discourage or even antagonize against the international institutions where they are members. People are aware of this tactic. People are informed about it. The governments constantly show support and want to show the importance of this membership of the institutions. So people are more resilient then. People, when they encounter this information, they can either recognize it or do not really take it so much into consideration because they have already developed certain understanding and trust and awareness. Another measure is, for example, leading from the front. So you would have certain authoritative personalities, be it, government officials, presidents, or influencers who themselves in the beginning of the crisis started wearing the masks and inform people and show by example how and what should be done. And therefore, when people see this and they see it repeatedly, they are much less likely to fall into the traps or be influenced by more fringe or kind of marginal narratives floating somewhere. And they may even want to be leading themselves and be an example for others because they see the power in this kind of leadership. And maybe the third, which I would want to highlight, is linked to education, which is a much longer measure, or critical thinking, which needs to be developed in the whole of society. And I say it because I know in Berlin, just a few more days of Hannah Arendt, who was big protagonist, and also the power of judgment, which I think is very important also today, this need to develop the critical thinking of people, to judge the situation in a timely manner, to be able to recognize credible sources, and also the responsibility of the other actors such as media organizations or government is indeed, and I will follow up on the previous thought, to support the pluralism of media and to support and protect investigative and independent journalism. So there is no one answer to different narratives or one measure that could be used. There is a plurality of the measures that have to be used also over a longer period of time. But I think all ultimately will come to the trust and education, which needs to be built through these different measures, engaging different actors and trying to see it more holistically, because disinformation in the information space is only one of the tactics that some with so-called malign actors take. So they need to be understood as part of a much broader playbook or potentially plan or strategic behavior that we need to be able to understand and address properly.
Wow, Nad'a, it's a great set of answers, very concrete. We need trust, we need resilience, we need also statesmen that will set examples. Sounds maybe not that difficult, but as we see, it is not that easy as well. So thank you so much for these answers. Now I would like to ask Jurgis also again two questions. So again, coming back to EU's response and EU versus disinfo experience of being targeted by Russia, how was it exposed, so that we see some of your work on the ground, plus again the recommendations. From your experience, what are the lessons learned for EU response, and what can be done better? I know you cannot criticize your own institution, but we can approach it from a slightly different perspective. What can be done even better in the future?
Thank you, Carolina. No, I think we are often very much self-critical. So, we are very much open to the constructive critique, on what we do tackling disinformation. And actually, Court of Auditors now is completing the first ever performance audit on EU actions tackling disinformation. So I think, very soon, early next year, you will have a kind of a very interesting mapping, what EU institutions and member states are doing right, and maybe what needs to beef up, to tackle disinformation. Look, I mean, in terms of our lessons learned, to counter disinformation, I think Nad'a already mentioned, some of the, let's say, strategies, policy responses that we need, to address the problem. I would start probably with the most important thing, is that in any response that we have has to be really like top. I mean, we cannot tackle the problem, by introducing any kind of, Ministry of Truth or censorship instruments or anything like that. So and the other point that I want to make is that we can only tackle the problem really in a consolidated terms. Definitely are not, let's say, strong enough to address the issue. So we need really, as we say in Brussels here, whole of society approach to address the problem. I think what we can do, I mean, to resolve the issue, we also need to think what are the actions that could raise the costs for some of these adversaries who try to attack our open societies. Here we can talk, of course, about state actors, but we can talk also about non-state actors like Daesh, for example, who also wage disinformation or propaganda campaigns in the EU member states. And there are a lot of things that we can do in order to raise the cost, media laws, strengthening the regulators, to, a lot of actions that could be built at the grassroots level, with involving fact checkers, for example, and now European Union actually supporting very much a project called European Digital Media Observatory in this regard. So there are basically, think, how we can protect essentially our democracies here at home, and also think in a way how we can promote some of our democratic practices in and around EU neighborhood, because promoting democracy, working together on strategic communication campaigns with our partners in, for example, Lubov in Ukraine or in Georgia or in the Western Balkans, everywhere. I think also, the measures that that allows us, kind of to strengthen our response to disinformation. And I think the sort of the key thing is to do it together with the media organizations and with the civil society. I mean, I cannot sort of overstress this issue. In terms of attacks on EU versus disinfo campaign, I mean, definitely we've seen them, in the last years. We are often criticized in pro-Kremlin disinformation ecosystem. We are ridiculed, we are attacked, but I think we take it, if you like it, as a measure of recognition of our work. That I think in most of the cases it really encourages us to do more, and we are very much confident about our findings and our approaches, because they very much correlate, to many other experts. And some of the reports, for example, that we published in spring about COVID-19 related disinformation, were identified, the strategies used by many state actors, were identified the narratives, were actually also, a very good starting points for raising awareness in the society about how COVID is misused in disinformation attacks. So that's a bit of my angle, and over to you, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Jurgis. Maybe I will turn now to Maciej Kawecki, because you, Maciej, you in a way implement parts of the lessons learned and the recommendations that were mentioned, for example, by Nad'a, by building this resilience, shaping awareness narratives, educating citizens. So I would like to ask you, from your also not only theoretical but also practical point of view of working also with children, what are the recommendations from your perspective of how to counter effectively disinformation, but also this other question that I wanted to ask to you from a slightly different perspective. So disinformation really pays. It pays to many of us. That's why it is created. Also, it pays to big platforms, and how to ensure the privacy of data that we use. So, and recommendations.
Okay, so I will try to collect your questions and answer firstly of data used for our online lives, and secondly answer how we can, in my opinion, of course, act to weaken the impact of the disinformation. I think that the advancement in the computer industry today is unimaginable. The current smart watches have a few 100,000 times more computing power than the first supercomputers over the last 60 years. Our computing over power over computers has increased as much as a billion times, a million millions. And never in the history of the humanity devices increased its power as fast. Someone can ask about the cars. What's about cars? The cars increased, and Nicholas Carr, it's the American Pulitzer Prize winner, and author of the really recommended by me books, How the Internet Affects Our Brain. This is the title of the book. Explain how the Internet reduced our perception. We think faster, we think more chaotically. Sharing of our personal data is incomparably easier than 2-3 months before. And I think that it should be mentioned today directly that every day we provide more and more data about ourselves, and these data profiles are better and better day after today, and the day after tomorrow easier than tomorrow. So the information will become to us incomparably more and more profiled to our preferences, to our customs, I don't know, to our habits. So this information will be incomparably easier and easier. So it's not enough to limit, I think, the sharing of our data where it's necessary. We should look at the world more critically. We should look around us more critically. We must learn how to distinguish true from false, because false will always surround us, I think. So of course we must also, where of course it's possible, because it's not always possible, limiting of personal data about ourselves, but we will never fully about my opinions, my perspective, how can we act to weaken the impact of disinformation. So in my opinion, the way to fight with disinformation, it's not legislation. It's of course the Polish point of view, but today various bodies located in different parts of the world, I think, are responsible for disinformation. And every law, however, is theoretically limited, territorially, limited. So I don't believe that any national law can change to anything. The actions taken by the United States against Twitter and other similar corporations 2 months ago shows that the United States are ineffective. So indicated, as it was indicated by me before, for me, education is the solution. Education should build in us the ability to critically evaluate the reality around us. This is a very huge problem, and a problem arises in Poland. Why? Because when I talked to the Polish Minister of National Education about the need to introduce the new subject to the school called, for example, learning new media, he refused. When I asked why, he replied, because there is no human resources and professionals who can teach children. Then I answer, playing the role of the dean in a Polish university, that I cannot open such studies as long as I have no guarantees that graduates will find a job. What's about the people who finished them and the new subject will not be introduced to the school? And it's a huge problem from my point of view. So And this is the circle, and unfortunately, such circle is closed. Therefore, any solution. So for me, we should of course introduce the changes to the schools program, but such changes should come into force 2 years later. And during this time, universities should educate the staff, I think, like my school. Unfortunately, I agree that in Poland, teachers today have no qualifications in this field. Today, on the day of national education in Poland, this must be clearly stated, I think. We do not have teachers who could educate successfully about disinformation, how to distinguish, for example, opinions from unfounded criticism, what is trolling, what's the source of disinformation, you know? So that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Maciej. Also very concrete, so it's really appreciated. In the end, I will shortly just list them, all the short ones, so that we have the rule book of what to do internationally. So now, Lyubov, 2 questions to you. As you work in the hybrid warfare analytical group, how can disinformation be implemented as a very concrete hybrid warfare tool? You have an interesting, fascinating, and scary example. And also the second question, the last question, what are your recommendations? What are the silver bullets that Jurgi said that don't exist, but we now mention all together, also Jurgi's, a very good set of silver bullets?
Yes, I think that disinformation, unfortunately, has very practical, very real, very physical, very palpable implications sometimes. And one of the most vivid examples, one of the most shocking cases took place in Ukraine just recently, a few months ago, where the protests against evacuees from China were incited through exploitation of local fears, and particularly by sending fake letters from Ministry of Healthcare. The same Kremlin-linked hackers sent letters from Ministry of Internal Affairs before that, and similar messages on social media. So people threw stones. People in this small town in central Ukraine, this town is called Novi Sanzhare, they met evacuees from China with stones in their hands. They were throwing stones in the buses, and they were totally convinced that these people, these evacuees, are infected, and like this is like a operation coming from the government to infect them in this Novi Sanzhare town. And with regard to our possible response, I think that the first thing we should do is to embrace the fact that we will be living with disinformation for years. Like, it's not, I agree with Jurgis, it's not a single bottle where we should not just put out the fire with a bucket of water every time. We have to have fire station finally. So what we need is policies. We need systems of media literacy, systems of countering disinformation on every level. And among lessons learned in this whole story, this pandemic story, I think one of the lessons is for governments, first of all, the best way to counter disinformation is to counter it in advance. Not to counter it when the crisis is already emerged, right? But to build strategic communications in advice, to build a very steady, positive narrative to seem to be untrue for your citizens. If you have very strong narrative, malign purposes of the adversaries in advance. So this is like the first thing, and of course media is totally responsible for what is going on, and the media is spreading panic, and panic causes a lot of harm on different levels.
Not all the media.
not all the media, right? But traditional media should embrace the fact that they're responsible, and they should also have systems on fighting disinformation, media literacy systems, systems on fact-checking, and so on. So I think, like, I can totally agree with what was said by my colleagues. We need to respond to make holistic, not to be sporadic in our reactions.
Thank you very much, Lyubov. That was really great. And now to Patryk, Pawlak, your two final questions. First, what is the distribution of tasks in between the national, EU, and international levels as regards the tackling of disinformation at the moment? How this cooperation setup works? And second, of course, recommendations. So what would you suggest we could do, or we could do better to be more effective at tackling disinformation and its effects?
Okay, thank you, Karolina. Let me start by reacting maybe to a few things that we have heard so far, and I'll be very brief also because conscious of time. I think I agree with those who are maybe not necessarily believers in the current approach to the problem of disinformation. I mean, the whole discussion about educating citizens and creating media literacy, it's a very great long-term plan, but unfortunately, it's not going to help us nowadays. And I think what Lyubov said about disinformation is here to stay. I think another truism there is that, truth does not spread as fast as disinformation and lies. And studies being done on how actually people stick to the lie they have heard, even though there is a counter narrative or the spreads, it spreads. So I think there's a real merit in starting to think about how do we stop it and how do we fight it right now, rather than thinking about long term. And of course, these are not contradictory objectives, but we really have to think about both. And I think Jurgis will agree with me that when we talk about consequences, here we are failing a bit when we talk about how to actually impose consequences on those malicious actors. And that partly links to the problem of diffusion of responsibility when we counter disinformation. I mean, many speakers on this panel have stressed the importance of the national level, and I think, unfortunately, this is not something where the EU can actually impose any regulation on the member states, simply because it doesn't really have the competence. It should be targeted by such actions. Education being one of them, for instance. So where can we actually look for the answers, and where the EU tried to bring added value? And Jurgis has mentioned several examples of the EU's action and engagement with digital platforms, code of conduct, EU versus Disinfo. This is where we basically rely on external networks. Then we, of course, have this more kind of security-oriented conversation when we talk about hybrid threats, when we talk about sanctions, for instance. But very often we can also start looking in the direction of a criminal law or consumer law, for instance, to start thinking about the consequences if we want, and sometimes these are still very much unexplored avenues. Then finally, I think there is one more level that is very often neglected in the discussions about the disinformation or interference, which is the international level. I think we very often ignore the fact that disinformation is very often a violation of the national or international law and can be actually addressed and a fight at those levels. When we talk about COVID-19, for instance, spreading disinformation about COVID-19 can be a clear violation of a right to health as per Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, for instance. When we talk about freedom of expression, we have to keep in mind that this is actually freedom to seek and receive information, right? So spreading disinformation would also be a violation of the freedom of expression. And finally, when we talk about the principle of non-intervention as in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, again, we have a violation which could be addressed at the international level. All this to say that we have to be able to identify whether we're talking about disinformation and responses through the national laws, or whether we actually look at the international level and engage with states internationally. So I think when we think about recommendations, I think I would probably want to see more focus on strengthening the consequences dimension of our policy response. But that, of course, implies taking certain decisions about the threshold and basically how we define interference and different acts that could be addressed through the legal means or political means, but also maybe more imagination, as I said earlier, in how we use the existing tools. We have a cyber diplomacy toolbox, for instance, where that promotes the adherence to free, open, secure cyberspace, while spreading disinformation for internet would be a violation of that principle. So maybe why not try expanding this mechanism and toolbox towards disinformation as well. And finally, I think the human rights regimes that already exist might be quite useful avenue for fighting disinformation. As I said, that refers very much to freedom, to protection of freedom of information, but also the human rights sanctions regime that the EU is currently negotiating and hopefully will adopt soon as a potential avenue for that discussion.
Thank you. A lot of good advices. Okay, so I think we have run out of time. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry we couldn't make even more use from our great experts. And as I said, we EURACTIV Poland will write an article both in Polish and in English about what has been said here, so that everyone can read it. But what has been recommended, some recommendations that have been mentioned. So making use of the human rights regimes and framework that might be helpful in tackling disinformation systems. Nina's recommendation to fight disinformation at the ballot box, to make use of your right and vote whenever you can. Nad'a, to build resilience, to vote for responsible statesmen and to build trust together. Jurgis, taking the holistic approach, proactive one in promotion of democracy, and doing that in cooperation with the media and civil society. Maciej, we need to look at the world more critically in order to be able to distinguish true from false. And it sounds easy, but easier said than done. So it's not an obvious recommendation. And he said also that it's not only legislation that we need, but also introduction of disinformation topics into schools, and also training our teachers. Lyubov, systematic response in creating media literacy to counter disinformation in advance, and also making media more responsible for sometimes being also engaged in creating or promoting disinformation. So thank you very much, our dear panelists, Nina Jankowicz, Maciej Kawecki, Nad'a Kovalčíková, Patryk, Pawlak, Lyubov Cybulska, and Jurgis Vilčinskas. It was a real honor to have you here. Thank you to our co-organizer, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, that has helped us with organization. And thank you to all our participants that have been so patient to stay with us despite the troubles in the beginning. And now let's get us all fight disinformation. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.